War Photographer by Caroline Duffy. In his darkroom, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church in key, a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries. This man's wife. How he sought the approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the airplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care.
Caroline Duffy's War Photographer presents a highly descriptive and conscious human interpretation of the life of a war photographer. The setting of the poem and where the main persona lies is in a dark room made for process and photography. However, the speaker or voice of the poem ventures the reader into the memories and experiences of the persona. All indications lead to the fact that the persona is indeed a war photographer. The speaker depicts a person who has had a great deal of experience with war zones and terror, as we are given constant reminders of this, such as the image of children running in a nightmare heat, as well as known places of conflict such as Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. Ultimately, it is quite clear that Duffy uses the voice of the poem in a manner as if it were giving us insight into a life unknown, the life of someone who makes money off of war and the complications that go along with that. I read this poem in an often removed tone, as the voice of the poem generates the notion of a war photographer who has grown emotionless in order to combat their moral conflicts and help them continue their work. This can be clearly seen in the last line of the poem, as the war photographer stares impassively at where he makes his living.
The addressee of the poem is far less straightforward than the persona. However, multiple references towards viewers of the war photographer's work are made. This allows a feeling that the poem is meant to convey how difficult the life of the war photographer may be. This allows the notion that the poem is meant to be addressed to the viewers of the photographer's work.
The poem provides an alternative viewpoint, which I myself have never identified, regarding the moral complications that people who profit off of war every day have. In the last stanza, the speaker says, "They do not care," referring to the viewers and how they have little knowledge about how difficult it is to go to war zones and experience the horror of war day in, day out. The poem features an extremely well-developed rhyme scheme, as well as compelling imagery to ultimately highlight and emulate the overall meaning of the terror war may cause and the moral complications people who make their living off of war suffer from. The poetic technique of rhyme often goes hand in hand with rhythm, as the two devices both contribute heavily towards the way words and phrases may be interpreted, as well as the way words are emphasized and highlighted. Imagery functions in some respects similarly regarding the highlighting of phrases. However, instead of this through sound, imagery paints a word picture in the mind of the reader. The last 2 lines of the second stanza illustrate very explicitly how Duffy utilizes both imagery and rhyme scheme to convey the poem's overall meaning. The fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. In respects to rhyme, we immediately hear the end rhyme between the lines with the words feet and heat. This end rhyme scheme has been present throughout the entirety of the poem. The end rhyme scheme generates a structure for the poem to be read off of, a structure which is consistent as the reader learns to expect certain sounds in certain places. Through this consistency in the poem, it is as if a routine has been formed. For war photographers, getting out of bed every day isn't an easy task, as they are constantly confronted with the moral implications of making money off of people suffering. This consistency, which we see through the end rhyme in the poem signifies and often embodies the routine which war photographers must generate for themselves to get themselves through the difficult days of capturing images which feature terror and death. As previously stated, imagery plays an indispensable role in conveying the meaning of the poem, for it paints the aforementioned word picture which subsequently highlights aspects of the text. The very section of the text that emulate the terror of war and atrocities which war causes. Referring to the last two lines from the second stanza, a very explicit and vivid image impregnates the mind of the reader, for they now clearly see the children running through a field of explosions and horror. Duffy uses this imagery as it is a very direct way of conveying the overall meaning to the reader. It becomes impossible to ignore the terror and horror of war when an image is so delicately constructed in your mind. This is ultimately how Duffy utilizes imagery in the poem as a direct contributor towards the overall meaning of the horror of war. The video of the man getting out of bed as a visual representation of the line, "He has a job to do," is expressing the difficulties someone who has the job of being a war photographer has. They have to get up every day, just like everyone else. However, it isn't easy for them after witnessing frequently the horrors of war, and knowing that they are profiting off of that. The short video sequentially highlights the difficulties morally which war photographers have. As previously stated, part of the overall meaning of the text is the terror of war. However, when the average person sees the terror war causes, we see it through the war photographer's photos instead of through the war photographer's actions and life. The poem is ultimately attempting to show that war touches everyone in drastic, negative ways, even if you aren't actually in